What would it be like to walk into a synagogue and hear Jesus or Paul speak? Unfortunately, we can't do that directly right now, but we can do it indirectly by learning more about synagogues in the time of Jesus. Let's do it. There's no mention of synagogues in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, they're everywhere, not only in Israel, but all over the Roman world. Synagogues were the focus of the religious life of most Jewish people in the time of Jesus, and a focus of the ministry of Jesus too. In Hebrew, a synagogue is called a Beit Knesset, which means a house or a place of assembly. It's a place where people got together to worship God. This is also the meaning of the word synagogue in Greek, synagogos, the origin of our English word synagogue. They were found in nearly every town and village where Jewish people were living. If a community wasn't large enough for a separate synagogue building, they would gather in homes. These house synagogues are the model on which the house churches were based that we read about in the New Testament, when Christianity was first getting started. A synagogue requires at least 10 adult men who can be counted on to attend services, since a service can't be held with less than 10. This is called a minyan, the minimum number needed for a service. So far, about 10 synagogues from the time of Jesus have been discovered in Israel. These discoveries are very helpful in helping us understand more about the New Testament. Jesus was very active in the synagogues in Israel. The New Testament tells us that he preached in the synagogues throughout all Galilee. In fact, Jesus seems to have made it his mission to take his message wherever Jewish people were living in the area. One synagogue we find him in quite often was the synagogue in Capernaum, of which you can see a diagram here. This synagogue went through a couple of different phases of development over the years. This is what it looked like sometime after the time of Jesus. But this later synagogue was built directly over the synagogue of the time of Jesus. So the white stones you see here are the later synagogue, and the black stones are what's left of the synagogue of Jesus' day. Here's another place where you can see the black stones from Jesus' day under the stone of the later white synagogue. Another synagogue recently discovered is at Magdala. This was the hometown of Mary Magdalene. In fact, that's the meaning of her name, Mary of Magdala. As you can see, this was a pretty small synagogue. It was destroyed shortly after the time of Jesus, so that means we're still seeing it, or what's left of it, as it looked in Jesus' day. This is one of the synagogues in which Jesus most likely preached. The entrance was right over here. The earliest synagogues were quite plain, but over the years they got more elaborate. This is from just after the time of Jesus. As you can see, the decoration was of geometric shapes and plants. This is because the Bible forbid making images of people or animals. The Jewish people were quite strict about this in the time of Jesus. These synagogues had either a square or a rectangular design and a roof held up by columns. One of the reasons for the columns and the roof in these synagogues was to provide windows to let light into the building. This was important because the focus of worship was reading the scrolls of the Bible, and you had to have light to be able to read the scrolls. There were step-like seats in front of the walls with an open space in the center of the room. This means that most of the people stood for much of the service. This is just like many Eastern Orthodox churches still do today. Most people stand throughout the service. However, it seems that there were some seats at the front, facing the congregation, that the Pharisees were keen to take. As Jesus put it in Matthew 23, "But they like the place of greatest honor when reclining at dinner, and the seats of greatest honor in the synagogues." These were seats reserved for rabbis, distinguished Pharisees, and the rulers of the synagogue. Women were separated from men, either in a balcony above or in a separate seating area on one side or at the back. This is the way it's still done today in many Orthodox synagogues. And in fact, that's how it was also done in the early churches. And it's still done this way today in many Eastern Orthodox churches. The main entrance doors faced Jerusalem. This led to the strange practice that after entering the building, you turned around to face the doors to worship. Well, why did they do this? So that they could face Jerusalem for worship. And this way, when the weather was nice, you could literally look out the doors toward Jerusalem during the prayers. Because the proper position for prayer was standing with your hands stretched out, facing Jerusalem. If you were in Jerusalem, you faced the temple for prayer. And if you were in the temple, you faced the sanctuary. Why was that? Well, do you remember King Solomon's prayer at the dedication of the temple in 1 Kings chapter 8? "Listen to the request of your servant and of your people Israel, which they pray toward this place." Even the Muslims originally prayed facing Jerusalem before they changed their direction of prayer to Mecca. Facing worshipers somewhere near the doors was a chest with wheels carrying the scrolls of the Bible. This was the Ark, a cabinet for the scrolls of the books of the Bible. The doors were at one end, and inside were the scrolls, probably put in like this. Can you see the scrolls there? Why was the Ark on wheels? Some think it was to move the scrolls to a safer location at night. After all, the scrolls were very valuable. Others think it was so that the scrolls could be taken out and the room could be used for other purposes, like a town meeting. After all, the synagogue was the largest room in town. One reason we know about for sure from the writings of the rabbis was so it could be brought out into the street for times of public fasting and prayer. Another opinion said that it was to show that the holiness of the synagogue does not come from the scrolls, but rather from the prayers that were offered up there. So who knows? There were probably many different reasons why the arks at that time were movable. But that practice was discontinued many centuries ago. Today, synagogue scrolls are kept in a permanent cabinet at the front of the synagogue. We know a lot about the Bible scrolls used in the time of Jesus because of the discovery of the famous Dead Sea Scrolls. Many of the Dead Sea Scrolls were books of the Bible. They were made from animal skins, a material known as parchment, just like the scrolls still used in synagogues today. And they were usually quite large compared, certainly, to the books that we use today. They're also very expensive because they're written by hand by a scribe, which, as you can imagine, takes a long time to do. Because they're so large, you need a big table to hold the scrolls while they're being read. If you look carefully here, you can also see the railing around the area of the table. This area is known as the bima, or podium. In many traditional synagogues, the bima is in the center of the room. In the days before microphones and sound systems, this made it easier for everyone to hear the Bible reading. But in other synagogues, it's at one end of the room. Here's another example from the Herva synagogue in Jerusalem. You can see the platform at the center with the table at the front for the reading of the Bible scrolls. In Jesus' day, they may have had another way to mark out the bima by putting the table for the scrolls up on a special raised platform, Or at least that's what we think this strange box-shaped object was used for. It dates back to the time of Jesus and was found in the ancient synagogue at Magdala that we looked at just a moment ago. As we said, this was one of the towns in which Jesus most likely preached, which means he may have read the Bible from this very podium, if that is in fact what it really was. Lots of people have been trying to figure out the symbolism of the designs carved on it. The most clear symbol you can see there in the middle is the menorah lampstand. What about the two pots on either side? They're probably pots of oil, which is what kept the lampstand lit. There were two readings from the Bible in the synagogues every Sabbath. They're mentioned in Acts chapter 13. This is when Paul was visiting the synagogue in Antioch of Pisidia, which is today in Turkey. It says, "And having come into the synagogue for the day of the Sabbath, they sat down. And after the reading of the law and of the prophets, the rulers of the synagogue sent someone to them, saying, 'Men, brothers, if you have any word of encouragement for the people, speak up.'" So the first reading mentioned here is from the law of Moses. This is what's known as the Torah in Hebrew, which usually refers to the first 5 books of the Bible, also known as the 5 books of Moses, although sometimes it's used to refer to the whole Bible. In Jesus' day, the entire Torah, that is the 5 books, were read through chapter by chapter every 3 years. Today, though, it's completed in just a year. Each week's reading is called a parashah. This is then divided into sections, and each of these sections is read by a different member of the congregation. But sometimes this is easier said than done. Do you notice anything about this Torah scroll? If you look carefully, you can see there are no chapter and verse numbers. Why is that? Because chapter numbers were not introduced until the Middle Ages, the 13th century, and verse numbers only in the 16th century. But the Torah scrolls used in a synagogue are still made the old way. So this makes it a lot harder to find your way around. And another thing, if you look very closely, there are no vowel points, those little dots and lines that help you pronounce the Hebrew correctly. This makes it difficult at times, even for those who speak modern Hebrew. Of course, back in Jesus' day, this was much less of a problem. Being called up to the Torah to read like this, which they call an aliyah, is considered a great honor. On Sabbaths, 7 readers come up to read, one after the other. On the weekdays, when the Torah reading is done, they only read a short portion of the reading for that week, and so only 3 people come up to read. This midweek Bible reading is done only on Mondays and Thursdays. Why Mondays and Thursdays? Because in the old days, these were the market days, when people came in from the surrounding communities, and so they would be able to attend the synagogue services. Today, though, since most people can't read the Torah correctly, they just say the blessings before and after the reading, and instead a designated reader reads for them. In addition to the main reading from the books of Moses, each week there was also a reading from the prophets. This is known as the Haftarah portion, which is usually connected in some way with the Torah portion. But the list of what the Jewish people consider the prophets are probably a little different than what you think of as the prophets. They include Joshua, Judges, and the books of Samuel and Kings as prophetic books. And notice that Daniel is not included. Daniel is still in the Bible. They just put his book in a 3rd section of the Bible known as the Writings. But this means that today he is not read in the Haftarah portion, along with certain other sections that the rabbis considered dangerous, like Isaiah chapter 53. But in Jesus' day, the Haftarah reading could still be chosen by the reader himself. As with the Torah portion, it was read standing. The people also stood to show respect for God's word. The same thing is still done in many traditional churches, even today. People stand for Bible readings, or at least for the reading of the gospel. We have an example of the Haftarah portion being read in Luke chapter 4, when Jesus was in Nazareth. It says, "As was his custom, he," that is Jesus, "stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. And he opened the scroll and found the place where it was written." So here's an example of Jesus himself doing the Haftarah reading in the synagogue. After the scripture readings came the sermon, called the drasha in Hebrew. For this, in the time of Jesus, the speaker would sit down. Now, I know that's just the opposite of the way that we do our services today, where the speaker stands up to give his message and the people are sitting. We also have an example of this in that same part of Luke, in fact, the same event. And he, Jesus, closed the scroll, that's after he finished the reading, and he gave it back to the attendant and sat down. And the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them. Now, I always wondered, why was everybody looking at him? I thought he just read and went back to his seat in the synagogue and sat down. But no, he sat down because he was ready to preach. Everyone's eyes were fixed on him because they were very interested in what he was going to say. And then he delivered his message. Well, where did they sit to give the message? They sat in the seat of Moses. This one was found in the synagogue at Chorazin in 1962. Before that, many people thought that the seat of Moses was just a saying. But now we know it was an actual seat. And when the rabbi gave a legal ruling from the seat of Moses, you were expected to obey it. As Jesus put it, "The scribes and Pharisees have seated themselves in the seat of Moses, therefore all that they tell you, do and obey." Even today, religious Jews are bound by the legal rulings made by their local rabbi. Now, the same thing is true for Catholics. When the Pope speaks ex cathedra, which means from the chair, every Catholic is supposed to obey it. In the synagogue, this seat was put up on a platform with stairs leading up to it. This was so that the people who were standing could see the speaker who was seated. We know this because these stairs are actually mentioned in the inscription on the bottom part of this seat of Moses. They were part of the same donation made to the synagogue. It says, "Be remembered for good, Yudan, son of Ishmael," this is the one who made the donation, "who made this stoa and its staircase." There's the staircase. "As his reward, may he have a share with the righteous." Well, the entire installation probably looked a lot like this later synagogue in Sardis. That's one of the cities mentioned in the book of Revelation. This synagogue was built many years after the time of the New Testament. So the Torah Ark was by that time permanently installed, most likely here. But on the other side, you can see a little stairway leading up to where the seat of Moses probably sat. But let's go back to that attendant that handed the scroll to Jesus. Do you remember that? Who was that in the synagogue? Well, this was the chazan, who helped with different odd jobs in the synagogue. This included cleaning up the synagogue, and in many places it also meant being the schoolmaster for the young boys who came to study in the synagogue during the week. This synagogue education was one of the earliest forms of public education in the world. Jesus himself would have studied in the synagogue like this as a boy. But this job has changed a little bit since then. Today, this is the person who leads the singing and the prayers in the synagogue. He's also known today as the cantor of the synagogue. This means that he is the one who usually says or sings the prayers, and the others will respond, "Amen." If a congregation has no cantor, any member of the congregation can be called on to lead the service. This person is then known as the shaliach, or the shaliach tzibur, which means the messenger, or we could say apostle of the congregation, someone who represents the congregation in that service. This is how the meetings were led in ancient times, before there were any cantors. So, whose job then was it to choose who would serve as the shaliach that day or in that service? Well, this was the rulers of the synagogue. So let's go back and look at that verse that talked about the Apostle Paul visiting a synagogue. Who asked him to speak? It says the rulers of the synagogue. In Greek, they're called the synagogue. Who were they? These were 10 elders who ran the synagogue, sort of a board of elders. They were the ones in charge. Several are mentioned in the New Testament. Maybe you remember Jairus, whose daughter Jesus raised from the dead in Mark chapter 5 and in other places. He was a synagogue ruler. In the book of Acts, we learn of a synagogue ruler named Crispus in the synagogue at Corinth. Crispus, along with his family, received the Lord and was saved. And in the same synagogue, there was another synagogue ruler named Sosthenes, who opposed Paul and was beaten by the Romans for no apparent reason. Now, this leadership by elders in the synagogue is the pattern of authority that Paul followed when he appointed elders in the churches. As it says in Acts 14, and when they had appointed elders for them in every church, having prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed. In the synagogues, the rulers of the synagogue, or we could call them the board of elders, were led by a president who was elected for that position for a year or two, and he was called the Nasi. This president would decide all the practical daily affairs of the synagogue. This is the leadership role that later turned into the local bishop in Christian churches, or what today we would call the pastor or head pastor. There was also the position of the Gabbai in the synagogues, or the Gabbai Tzedekah. This was the treasurer who collected money for charity. This is the position that in the churches came to be known as the deacons of the church. Today, though, in the synagogue, the Gabbai is the one who calls people up for the Torah reading, and he will often stand there to correct their reading if necessary. So that gives us a pretty good overview of synagogues in the time of Jesus. Before we close, I just want to mention briefly what happened in the synagogue services in Jesus' day, or I should say to give an overview of the synagogue services. Worship started with a couple of blessings, and then the Shema, Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And then there would be a prayer, and this was followed by what today is called the 18 benedictions, though there were fewer in Jesus' day, and only 7 are read on the Sabbath. The Lord's Prayer that Jesus taught us is basically a summary of the 18 benedictions. Then comes the priestly blessing from Numbers chapter 6. And then the scripture readings followed, and then came the sermon. Then there was a final prayer, some singing from the Psalms, and that was it. On the way out, they gave money for the poor. Well, there you have it. I hope you have a better understanding of synagogues so that when you read about Jesus and others like Paul teaching in the synagogues, you'll have a better understanding of what it was like. And hopefully, it will help you to better hear their message to us today.